Amen. So we still find ourselves in the season of home blessings for another couple of weeks, as you're all well aware. After the principal feasts of the church, and most notably after Christmas and Easter, it's the tradition in the Armenian church that you invite the priest to your home for a home blessing. It's an opportunity to invite that Christmas and Easter gospel into your home and to rededicate yourself. Rededicate yourself, of course, to the mission that we each have as Christians and to your commitment to living the gospel each and every day. And so each time around this year, I get a number of invitations to people's homes. And I get the opportunity to experience Armenian hospitality. When I first came to the parish, I was noticing that I was starting to get some tight pants around the seasons of home blessing, because each time I would go to visit with a family, inevitably they would put out some sort of a sweet, delectable dessert, and I would partake. After my first year, I realized I needed to kind of put some guardrails here, so I started making announcements saying, okay, please invite me for a home blessing, but please don't put any food out when I come. And so obviously, there is a piece of this that you go and you do 10 home blessings in a week. Sometimes that happens. They just all line up in the same week. And you can't eat a cookie each in every house that you go to. And you know what? That's not really the most gracious thing to do as a guest in someone's home. But I must confess something even more controversial, which is not simply that I was rejecting people's desserts because of my health and because of my weight, but because I actually don't really enjoy desserts. I guess people are very upset when I say it. I really don't enjoy desserts. There are a few exceptions. I've been known to polish a pint of ice cream without batting an eye here and there. But when it comes to pastries and when it comes to cookies and when it comes to cakes, it's just not really my cup of tea. Trust me, there are plenty of other unhealthy foods that I eat and often overeat, but sugar just isn't something that I regularly crave. This actually has been a point of consternation in my marriage. Early on, there were some things to be worked out because my wife, by contrast, has a large sweet tooth. And so whenever we'd be at dinner or out somewhere, she'd ask me to try a piece of this or a bite of that, and I would decline. She'd get upset with me. And then she began to learn over time to just stop asking. Whereas I personally could do without most desserts, I think it's interesting that we collectively as a culture use the phrase "to die for" when it comes to describing a particularly delectable pastry. We may at times feel like we can't live without our dessert or some other tasty treat. But what's ironic about that is that sugar is precisely the sort of thing that we can and maybe should try to live without. By contrast, the foods essential to our well-being are typically the foods that we take for granted. That is to say, the foods that we might actually die without are never the foods that we say that we could die for. I don't know about you, but I've never heard someone describe a plate of broccoli as a food that they could die for. My point is that we often covet the ancillary, the superfluous things of life, while taking for granted the most necessary, the most essential. Today, Christ describes his relationship with us by using the image of food. He describes himself as the bread which comes down from heaven to give life to the world. And in today's keto age, we may think of bread in a negative context, so for us it may conjure up all sorts of negative images. We view bread as maybe something to cut out of our diet, something that's unhealthy for us. And yes, with our modern bread here in America that's made with heavily processed grains and loaded with chemicals, it certainly could be good to cut some of that out of our diet. But when Christ is using this image, in the past, in ancient times, the bread that was made was fiber-filled. It was minimally refined, and it was actually the bedrock of civilization. And in fact, in most ancient languages, the words for food and for bread are one and the same. Often people would live for weeks or for months not eating anything except for bread. Because really, as long as you have a good, nutritious sourdough bread with a little salt and a little water, you can go for weeks and for months. It's actually for this reason that in Armenian, our Lenten period is described as Ahu Hatzmi, because there was a group of people who would only eat bread and salt through the entirety of the 40-day Lenten period. All of this to say that Christ very intentionally describes himself as bread. And yet far too often I think that we can treat him instead as cake. Just as we fill our bellies with the essential foods from our main course at dinner, and then at the end we may ask, do I have any more room for dessert? So too, we far too often tend to jam-pack our lives with social clubs and sporting events and extended work hours. And at the end of all of it, we try to see if we have any room open in our schedules to fit Christ in. And just as we passed around the dessert menu, and we curiously wonder what everyone at the table might order. Maybe one person will order the chocolate lava cake or another person the apple pie. So too, I think that we far too often see Christ as merely one among a myriad of options of religious leaders that we could choose to follow. Some have a taste for Jesus of Nazareth, while others have a preference for Buddha or Mohammed. We treat our faith as if it's different strokes for different folks. That we're just supposed to follow whichever faith makes us feel good. That yes, we happen to be raised as Christians, but there are many faiths that we could have chosen to follow. And all of them would probably bring us to have good morals and live a good life, as if that were the only purpose of our religion. We far too often view our faith as one among many choices, as an optional addition for our lives when it's convenient, because we view Christ as cake instead of bread. Later in John chapter 6, Christ will take this image a step further. And he will make sure that we do not see him simply as one of the spiritual guides that you could choose. When he says, unless you eat of my flesh and drink of my blood, you have no life in you. Quite bold words. These words that Christ are using are specifically speaking to the sacraments of Holy Communion that he would come to establish. That the bread and the wine that become his body and blood are food that is critical for the health of our soul. It is something that we cannot live without. And what we see in these words of Christ is something quite bold. It's the claim that without him in your life, first and foremost through the sacrament of Holy Communion, but throughout our weeks, through each and every day of our lives, if we do not partake of the Lord in some way, we do not have life in ourselves. This tone is quite striking, and yet it's even more striking in contrast to how we typically tend to approach our faith. I don't know about you, but I've had days where I've said, today I just don't feel like praying. You know what? Do I feel like this week I can have time to come to worship the Lord? Maybe, maybe not. Can I fit my Bible reading into my busy schedule? For our relationship with Christ to be transformative, he must be treated as essential to our lives. He can't simply become part of our lives when we feel inspired. He can't simply be inserted when there's room. We must treat our relationship with the Lord as the most essential endeavor that we engage in order for his presence to permeate into our lives and into our souls so deeply that we are transformed by his grace. So the question that Christ asks each of us today is, are we eating our daily bread? Or to put it another way, are we finding opportunities to come to the bread of life, Jesus Christ, each and every day? Or instead, are we treating him merely as cake, as the occasional dessert that you add in when there's room? Are you finding ways to regularly engage the Lord consistently, intentionally, and even at the moments when you don't feel like it? The Lord asks each of us, how might we add one new routine into our days, even if it's something small, something that might only take a few minutes, in order to ensure that each and every day I encounter the Lord? The Lord will indeed give us each day our daily bread. May we find the grace to seek out this bread each and every day of our lives. Amen.